Sarah, a beautiful young woman, was wandering through the narrow, dark streets of her hometown, Avignon, in the French countryside. Her hands were shaking a handkerchief against a pale face, very different from what it had once been. The fog that enveloped the entire city of Avignon seemed to echo his own haze of inner despair. Every step was a struggle against an enormous storm roaring inside her, fueled by the recent news that her cancer had finally spread like an insidious weed, sapping her strength and completely destroying her hope. It was at times like these that Sarah sought not only refuge, but also diagnoses in the cold, impersonal corridors of the local hospital, where the atmosphere of despair was almost palpable. It was as if the pain and suffering clung to the walls, whispering stories of struggle and also of loss to anyone willing to listen. It was on one of these gloomy afternoons that Sarah found herself standing in front of the ajar door of a doctor's surgery, the dim light casting an elongated shadow across the empty corridor. With a resigned sigh, she hesitantly pushed the door open, preparing herself for yet another appointment that, deep down in her soul, she knew was a mere formality. Dr. Benjamin Hayes was sitting behind his desk, his eyes fixed on a pile of papers that seemed to absorb all his attention. His stern face was an impenetrable mask, revealing almost nothing about the real man behind the doctor. When he saw Sarah enter, he looked up, his professional expression giving way to a mixture of compassion and determination. "Sarah," he began, his soft voice echoing in the oppressive silence of the room, "please have a seat." Sarah slid into the chair in front of Dr. Benjamin Hayes' desk, her mind spinning with a whirlwind of indescribable emotions. She watched as the doctor studied her test results, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. "How are you feeling?" asked Dr. Hayes, his piercing eyes scanning hers for any sign of weakness. Sarah hesitated for a moment, struggling with the decision to share her true anguish. Finally, she sighed, the words escaping her trembling lips. I'm scared, doctor. Afraid of what the future holds. I don't think I can bear it." Dr. Hayes nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand, but know that we're in this fight together, Sarah. I won't give up on you." The doctor's words were like an anchor amidst the raging storm raging in Sarah's heart. She longed to believe them, desperate for any shred of hope that might light her way through the darkness. And so, in that instant, a silent bond was forged between them, uniting them on a journey of challenges and redemption that would change the course of their lives forever. The days dragged on like slow shadows over Sarah's face, each dawn bringing with it a new dose of uncertainty and anxiety. She plunged headlong into the exhausting treatments, each chemotherapy session an arduous battle that completely tested the limits of her physical and emotional endurance. The poison flowing through her veins was a constant reminder of her own fragility, a cruel reminder that the line between life and death was thinner than she had ever imagined, and that human life is only held together by threads, where any slip is capable of snatching it away instantly. She remembered times gone by, perhaps a time not so long ago, but days when she was happy. She remembered her childhood in the company of her mother, and how suddenly vague memories came to her of her father, who had died of cancer. It came to her like a bitter wine. She didn't remember much. She was still very young when he was taken away, but she could clearly see his face, which against all reason had a happy countenance even after his death, and also her mother's cries of despair and agony when the coffin was finally closed. When this happened during the night, she would wake up suddenly and sometimes start crying, alone and in agony. However, even in the midst of her despair, Sarah found strength in the comforting presence of Dr. Hayes. For her, he was more than just a doctor. He was a beacon of hope in a stormy sea of despair, an anchor that held her steady when the waves of uncertainty threatened to sweep her away. On a gray autumn afternoon, as Sarah waited anxiously for the results of her most recent tests, a palpable tension hung in the air. Dr. Benjamin Hayes entered the room with a solemn expression, his dark eyes reflecting the weight of news he was afraid to share. "Sarah," he began, his voice a harsh whisper in the stillness of the room, "the results, they're not good." Sarah's heart leapt into her throat, the air escaping from her lungs in an agonizing sigh. She felt herself sinking into the chair, the doctor's words echoing in her ears like a distant echo in an endless abyss. "The cancer, it spread further than we expected," Dr. Hayes continued, his fingers clenching the paper in his trembling hands. "It's becoming more and more aggressive." A wave of despair washed over Sarah, threatening to drown her in its icy darkness. She felt herself suffocating under the crushing weight of the news, her body shaking with the intensity of her repressed emotions. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had been ripped away, leaving her adrift in a stormy ocean of pain and despair. What does that mean?" she asked, her voice like a fragile whisper in the deafening emptiness of the room. Dr. Hayes hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hope. "It means we need to be more aggressive in our treatment. We need to fight with everything we've got. It's going to have to be even stronger." The doctor's words were like a ray of light in the darkness, a promise of hope in a world full of shadows. Sarah knew that the battle ahead would be arduous and painful, but she was determined to fight to the end, not just for herself, but for those she loved and for those who had put their faith in her ability to overcome the most difficult adversities. Every day, Sarah plunged headlong into the battle for her own survival. Each treatment session was a test of endurance, a test of her determination and courage in the face of the adversity that threatened to consume her. However, in the midst of the suffocating darkness of pain and suffering, she found comfort in the constant presence of Dr. Hayes, whose tireless dedication was a source of inspiration and hope. Dr. Hayes, a renowned and ambitious doctor, had had a meteoric career, a rise to stardom. But that was another time. Now, according to him, the best of his life had passed, and he found himself in a mixture of disillusionment and disbelief. His little faith in life itself having been totally destroyed when in October 2004 he lost his only son in a tragic car accident. He was at that moment at the peak of his career, but even though he was one of the most renowned doctors, he hadn't been able to save his most precious possession. He had put it off for many years, until time tried to alleviate the ailments, but not cure them completely. Working with terminally ill patients had affected his pride, and seemed to have left him somewhat anesthetized and completely disbelieving. 2 decades after the incident, he still found himself thinking about the sweet child. He hadn't been able to recover completely, and that incident had also been the beginning of the downfall of his marriage. His wife, even more than him, had felt the loss completely, and without being able to divert her attention to other everyday tasks, she gradually became like a sickly shadow wandering around the house, seeming to search in some way for the one who was gone. But no matter how hard she looked, she couldn't find him. She died of countless asymptomatic illnesses brought on by sadness and low immunity, and not even Dr. Hayes was able to help her find a cure. She died in her sleep, with a smile on her face, because she knew that only in death would she find the son she loved so much. But Benjamin Hayes couldn't bear the loss any longer. He sank completely into his work as a way of forgetting the failures and losses of his personal life, which he had judged to be a failure. And not even the medals of honor and tributes received through medicine could give him at least a bittersweet taste when he was faced with the imminent loneliness of every night. He was a constant user of sleeping pills and others to keep him on his feet during the day. As time went by, Sarah found herself plunging deeper and deeper into a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. There were days when she felt invincible, fueled by the promise of a future free from the cancer that had haunted her deepest dreams. But there were also days when the crushing weight of the disease seemed to suffocate her, leaving her at the mercy of turbulent waves of despair and hopelessness. It was on one of these days that she went to her mother. "Daughter, how are you?" her mother asked her, putting her under her shoulder, and there she cried copiously for long minutes, cried for herself, for her life so far taken over by the damn disease, as she put it, and also cried for what she didn't even know she felt. How could you endure all those years with Dad fighting cancer? How could Dad be happy even with cancer? Then her mother told her something that marked her forever. "Sarah, Robert, your father, appreciated life more than anyone. Even on the most difficult days, even on the days of greatest pain, he still remained hopeful. He was still the one who comforted me and didn't let me down. Life, Sarah, doesn't go backwards. Time doesn't turn back. It's like a river flowing towards the sea. Your father said something to me the night he left, when I asked him how he felt after so many years in that exhausting struggle, and how he managed to stay happy even so. He said, and keep this with you. Joy is good for your health. To be always sad is to die little by little. What good would it do me to complain and be sad if the fate will be the same? It's better to live smiling, and when the time comes I can be light and not regret having been consumed by sadness." When Sarah heard that, I cried. I felt it was a farewell. So he wrote me something on a piece of paper that I keep with me to this day. Sarah's mother, Tanya, got up and took a small box from the dresser drawer, inside which was a gently folded envelope, and handing it to her daughter said, "Sarah, darling, open it and read it whenever you feel hopeless." Sarah swallowed dryly and realized that staying calm in the midst of good things is very simple. Having faith and smiling in the midst of a good time is what anyone can do. True faith lies in staying happy in the midst of a storm, and that her sadness was gradually killing her inside, even more than the cancer. and she realized that if she had to leave, it was best to do so with acceptance. On a cold winter's afternoon, while Sarah was waiting for another round of treatment, she once again found herself immersed in a whirlwind of dark thoughts. She wondered if she had the strength to keep fighting, if it was worth enduring the pain and suffering in search of a cure that might never come. It was as if every cell in her body was crying out for rest, begging for a truce in an endless war. But as she thought this, she smiled, and the smile washed away the pain and suffering. "Sarah," called Dr. Hayes, his voice breaking the oppressive silence of the waiting room and bringing Sarah suddenly back from her thoughts. "Are you ready?" Sarah raised her eyes to meet his, finding in them a mixture of compassion and determination. She nodded, forcing a fragile smile onto her trembling lips. "Yes, I'm ready." As she followed Dr. Hayes through the sterile corridors of the hospital, Sarah felt flooded with a sense of calm that had long escaped her grasp. It was as if, for a brief moment, she was being led away from the storm roaring inside her, guided by a soft, comforting light in the midst of the darkness. Upon arriving at the treatment room, Sarah sat in silence, watching as Dr. Hayes prepared the drugs that would be injected into her fragile veins. Every movement was precise and careful, as if he were performing a sacred ritual in honor of her battle for life. As the needle penetrated her skin, Sarah felt a twinge of pain spread throughout her body, followed by a feeling of comforting warmth that enveloped her like a loving embrace. It was as if, for a brief moment and for the first time since the treatment began, she was being enveloped in an aura of peace and serenity, chasing away the shadows that threatened to consume her. At the end, Sarah felt exhausted, but also invigorated by a new sense of hope. She knew the battle was far from over, but for now, she was determined to enjoy every moment of relief she could find, knowing that each day was a step towards her redemption. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Dr. Hayes, already used to dealing with all this, was almost insurmountable, trying not to get attached to the patients, knowing that their fate was uncertain, and he was still afraid of losing what he had become attached to. So he avoided as much as possible a more affectionate approach. Beyond the clinical walls, and despite his words of confidence, they were until then mostly innocuous words, said only because it was what they expected him to say. But with Sarah there was something different. The bond between Sarah and Dr. Hayes grew stronger every day. While Hayes was often skeptical and even pessimistic, trying to get around his words, telling things in a milder way, Sarah went deep in search of what was really happening to her. "Doctor, I need you to tell me the truth. How much chance do I have of getting out of this alive?" Hayes swallowed, feeling a knot forming in his throat. "Sarah, I'd rather not talk percentages. I need to know, doctor. I'd say not even 5%. "Good," she replied happily. "Are you happy?" he asked in surprise, thinking that she wanted to get rid of her suffering as quickly as possible. "If there's still a chance, I'll cling to hope. What if I told you there was no chance? I can't go back to the time when I hadn't yet been stricken with cancer, but I can and must move towards a time when it no longer afflicts me. And if that time means that I have to leave, I'd rather leave happy, knowing that I lived my days with joy and didn't waste them in despair." Sarah left the office confidently, while Hayes remained still for a long time, static, staring into nothingness. In his mind there was only his life after all the tragedies that had followed the sudden loss of his son and his wife. In that fateful and terrible year, when the two most precious people in his life were taken away, he had stopped smiling and dreaming, and without realizing it, for 20 years he had sunk completely into whining and despair, realizing only now that he had taken refuge in his work precisely to stay close to death. In his patience he felt the fragility of life, and in a way that was not sadistic, but desperate, it comforted him. That night, he couldn't sleep, thinking only of Sarah and the smile on her face as she left his office. How? He wondered. What was the secret behind joy in the midst of chaos? With all this, Hayes broke down a barrier that he himself had erected and began to get closer to Sarah beyond the walls of the office. Sarah's almost sudden faith and joy made him not only want to understand where that practically inexhaustible source of light was coming from, but also made him not afraid of loss. After all, the person standing in front of him could see beyond the problems. He wanted some of that for himself. And in this way, a friendship was born. A simple patient was transformed into a partnership marked by a mutual determination to defy the odds and achieve victory. They shared not only the ups and downs of the battle against cancer, but also the moments of silence and reflection, when words became unnecessary in the face of the deep connection that bound them together. On a sunny spring afternoon, as Sarah anxiously awaited the results of her latest scans, A palpable tension hung in the air. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, anxiety bubbling up inside her like a raging river in a storm. But the smile remained on her face, etched on her lips, almost as if it had been engraved there forever. But everything now told her that fate was hanging in the air, waiting to reveal its final sentence. When Dr. Hayes entered the room, his solemn face was an impenetrable mask of contained emotions. He held a white envelope in his trembling hands, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hope or despair. "Sarah," he began, his voice a harsh whisper in the oppressive stillness of the room. "The new results, they're here." Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the doctor in front of her, her heart hammering in her chest like an uncontrolled drum. She could feel the weight of expectation bearing down on her, each passing second stretching to breaking point. Dr. Hayes hesitated for a moment, his fingers trembling as he tore open the envelope and removed the folded paper inside. His eyes scanned the lines written there, his expression contorting into a mixture of surprise and incredulity. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice choked by the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "The results, they're unbelievable." Sarah held her breath, her eyes wide with disbelief at the doctor's words. She felt a wave of heat spread throughout her body, a sense of euphoria that threatened to consume her in its entirety. "The cancer? It's finally in remission," Dr. Hayes continued, his voice echoing in the solemn silence of the room. You're cured, Sarah." The doctor's words echoed in her mind like a heavenly symphony, banishing once and for all the shadows that had tried to haunt her days for so long. She felt flooded with a sense of relief and gratitude. Her eyes filled with tears of joy as the reality of her healing began to set in. For Sarah, the miracle of medicine was not just the cure of her cancer, but the rediscovery of hope and faith in the ability of human beings to overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. She knew that her journey was still far from over, but for now, she allowed herself to sink into the sweet serenity of a moment of well-deserved triumph. With the news of her cancer's remission, Sarah felt reborn into a world tinged with vivid colors and endless possibilities. Every breath was a celebration of life, every ray of sunshine a blessing that caressed her skin like a comforting hug. She found herself plunged into a whirlpool of emotions, each one more intense than the last, as she adjusted to the reality of her miraculous cure. And her smile became even more pronounced. On a warm summer afternoon, Sarah and Dr. Hayes met in a cozy cafe in the city center. It was as if, for a brief moment, they were just two old friends enjoying each other's company, without the shadows of the past or the uncertainties of the future to obscure their vision. "Do you remember the first time we met?" asked Sarah, her eyes sparkling with the memory of a not-so-distant past. Dr. Hayes nodded, a nostalgic smile curving his lips. "How could I forget? It was the beginning of a journey that changed my life forever." Sarah looked at the doctor in front of her, her expression serious as she considered his words. "Change your life?" Hayes took a sip of hot coffee and breathed deeply, saying, "I haven't shared that with many people in my life." And after telling him about the tragic loss of his son and his wife, he also told him about how he had lived his life in despair ever since, turning away from everything that could in any way bring him pain. "But luckily you came along and I was able to give it all new meaning," said Benjamin Hayes, gently touching Sarah's hand in a gesture of silent comfort. "You're a true hero, Sarah. Your courage and determination have certainly inspired not only me, but everyone around you." Sarah returned the touch, and as the sun set over the distant horizon, Sarah felt an even greater sense of peace and gratitude settle in her heart, a certainty that, although her journey may have been difficult, she had emerged on the other side stronger and more resilient than she had ever imagined possible. "But, Sarah, what's the secret to happiness? It wasn't always like this." She told me about all her hopelessness and how Dr. Hayes, even though he feared death, had helped her in those first steps, and also everything her mother had told her about her father, and also the note she had left, the last thing she wrote before she left. "What was it?" Benjamin asked. "Smile, just for today. Tomorrow you might not be here anymore." Benjamin Hayes and Sarah Lovato married a few months after the end of the cancer in a family ceremony, shortly after which they had two children, Esperanza and Robert Hayes, who were much loved.